Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's time to start this conversation. It's not such a rewarding thing to be the last panel of the conference. Please don't cry after we're finished. There'll be another BSF. There'll be another chance for all of us to meet and discuss these issues. I would like to welcome you to this conversation. My name is Alex Ronishvili-Grigoriev. I'm the president of the Council for Inclusive Governance, and I would like to thank the organizers once again for doing what they are doing. It's a privilege to be here, and it's really a great thing to cooperate with BSF once again in organizing this panel. Before I start here, I would like to start there, over here. I've been resisting for many, many years using Facebook. And now my 5.5-year-old entered school. And apparently the way they communicate with parents is through Facebook. And I had to finally surrender and give up. And my goodness, I discovered the world I never knew. Very interesting, just as complicated as the real world. And sometimes as brutal as the real world. But I also have learned some tricks that world has and the real world doesn't. And apparently I'm not the only one. One day I was dropping my daughter off at school, and I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, and one of my favorite commentators, she was making the same points, only much better than I'm making right now. So I would like to see in the audience, could you give me a show of hands? How many of you have actually unfriended, muted, blocked, or I learned a new word, ghosted, someone on Facebook or Twitter? Oh, come on, be honest. I know the statistics. Yeah, and you too. Yeah, and me too. Because they said something about politics, religion, child upbringing, food that you like and they don't. How many of you have at least one person whom you have avoided because you didn't want to talk to them? On the street, in the corridor, or told them that you have a twin so you don't have to talk to them when you actually see them and they see you? I think the statistic is much higher. Maybe in America they're higher than in this region. What it all shows to me, we're so polarized. I'm concerned with the state of affairs between Kosovo and Serbia, but I'm also concerned about the state of civility in our societies, including my own. And I'm worried that that state of incivility is seeping into every single conversation, including this one. And this is one of the reasons why Sonia Licht and I were sitting in the spring of this year, and we were thinking maybe enough of politicians for a change. Maybe enough of incivility and shouting people for a change. Maybe we should do something else. The lack of that civility, I think, affects our ability to deal with very important issues. Yesterday we heard from our friends who presented a brilliant study, something that you see yourselves every day. We see tabloids where people cutting heads off on ethnic basis. We see wars being declared. We see all sorts of vocabulary that shouldn't be used. I think the beauty of BSF is that BSF gives us an opportunity to have a conversation. And to tell you the truth, at the core of the mission of the Council for Inclusive Governance is also to encourage, especially politicians, to have a decent conversation, to have civility in discourse. And it's also in the DNA of CIG's main funder, Switzerland, to have a civil conversation. And this is what BSF does, and this is why I feel at home here at BSF. It used to be that in order to have a polite conversation, the only thing you needed to do is to follow the example of Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady when he told Eliza Doolittle, just talk about the weather and your health and you'll be fine. Now with climate change and anti-vaccine, I'm not so sure this is such a great idea. In the world that we live today, almost every subject we talk about becomes radioactive. We start arguing, we start screaming at each other, our politicians cannot talk to each other. Most often we hear shouting than a conversation. We don't want to compromise, and we have the conversations when we don't listen. If we listen to reply rather than to understand, because it takes an effort, it takes energy to understand and to listen. We encourage conversations, both CIG and BSF, and this is why you have these group of people in front of you. These people have impressed me over the years because of their ability to have a conversation even when they disagree on a very difficult subject. And these people always leave me inspired and energized after their conversations, and this is why we ask them to come here and have this conversation in front of you. Our inspiration team, I hope they'll inspire you today, is Agon Malici, who is an analyst and columnist and also the chair of the board of Sbanker in Pristina, Milica Andrić Rakic, and I think this is a historic. She told me I can do that. I think it's a historic. Milica is not alone. There is a little Mara inside who is due in 3 months. So we have actually a perfect gender balance, 3 girls and 3 boys on the stage. Milica is, so yes, you can do it. You can do that. Milica is a well-known analyst and also journalist for KOSEF in North Mitrovica in Kosovo, probably one of the most important media sources in Serbian language in Kosovo. Una Hajdari is an international well-known journalist who writes for many newspapers and magazines of record, also based in Pristina, but more often she's based somewhere else, like Eastern Ukraine or some other nice place. And last but certainly not least, Stefan Surlic works at the Faculty of Political Science here in Belgrade and is also a well-known analyst on the issues that we're discussing. Another thing about this panel, for the first time we have a panel where everyone comes from Kosovo, apart from me. So with this introduction, I would like to start the conversation. And my first question might sound a little bit naive, maybe a little bit off the cuff, but let's suppose Kurti succeeds in forming the government. There are also, you hear also of ifs, buts, and so on and so forth. But let's suppose he succeeds and he forms the new Kosovo government. So how will we get to the first Kurti-Vučić meeting, and how do you see it? So this is the first question to my panelists. What does the first Kurti-Vučić meeting look like, and how do we get there? Let's just go one by one. Agon, you can start, and then we'll go. How does it look like? Kurti-Vučić. It hasn't happened before.
Okay. Is it on or?
Yeah, you just start talking, then I know what to do.
Okay, thanks for throwing the big bomb right at the start. It's hard to see it happening right now. It really is. Because I really feel that this government creation process will take some time. And then we will have this, phase where Serbia will go into an election kind of process. So I feel that the dialogue is going to move from this state of sort of stalemate that it has been in for the past year into a state of deterioration, I think. Because I don't see, for that meeting to happen, I don't see any of the important drivers sort of pushing for it, the international community or the international factors have been sort of, the EU has lost all credibility as, it was losing its credibility as a mediator in the Kosovo dialogue, but with the continuous signals it has sent over the past few years, especially after yesterday with North Macedonia and Albania, the EU has lost all credibility in the region to sort of to be that driver. The US is coming in with an offensive on this issue, but it's unclear yet. With 2 envoys, but it's still unclear. The messages are coming differently. What we're used to, for things to happen in the Balkans, we were used to the West being united and speaking with one voice, and with now mixed or different messages coming to different actors, I feel that external driver for that first meeting to happen soon is kind of missing.
But when it happens, what happens in the room? Do they shout at each other? Do they say?
No. I don't think so. I mean, Kurti has, for the first week after becoming first in the election, he has taken a little bit of he has taken off the populist kind of tone that he used to have. It's standard practice, I guess, for populists. And he's sounding like a statesman a little bit. And I think he understands the weight of the moment, and I think that he can surprise, as much as he has transformed over the last decade, and he has. You know, I think he can be somebody who could be more constructive on the dialogue than people think. Although he publicly says that I have changed only strategy but not aims and goals, I still think that he can sit at the table, but only if there is this sort of idea that that will lead to something. And right now, it doesn't look like it's leading to anything.
Milica, how does it look like? Vučić meets Kurti.
First, I have to say that Kurti himself is not really my cup of tea, so I have very strong opinions about him, but I do recognize that they might be biased. I might not have enough of time for all of them, but I think that what's happening in Kosovo now resembles a lot of the situation in Serbia in 2012. And I see a lot of tendencies with Kurti that might bring him to be a new Vučić in Kosovo. So there's underlying autocracy trait about him that is making me very, very uncomfortable. But again, many of my friends and colleagues whose opinion I really cherish disagree with me, so I will leave the space that I might be wrong. I think that the initial meeting is not that unlikely to happen. The first meeting, I don't think that he would just refuse to meet, but I do think that he would be very uncomfortable and surprised by how much he cannot really do what he expects to be able to do. So he was in the opposition for 10 years. He never had the responsibility of the government. He never really had to deal with intricacies of Kosovo's administrative system, especially when it comes to some of the rights of Kosovo Serbs. And like a day after the election, he already made a blunder. He already said that he's ready to go around some of the constitutional rights of Kosovo Serbs. And I don't think that necessarily he really wanted to do that. I really just think that he didn't read the constitution, that he didn't know.
No, sorry to interrupt you, but did that statement about not accepting Lista Srpska into the government, would that have any impact on the Kosovo Serbs, or what kind?
And it's very, if he continues with messages like that, he's just going to create, there isn't currently grassroots support for Srpska List, but if he continues to do so, he will intimidate Kosovo Serb community, and he will cause for Srpska List to have more of a grassroots support, because I think that's, but the main issue is that I think that he didn't really know, he didn't really understand, because he never cared about these things. He would attack the previous governments for depending too much on the Serbian political entity, but again, I think that's out of him not knowing all of the intricacies of this system. So I think he's in for a lot of surprises. I don't think he would shout. He is an intelligent man. He wouldn't allow himself to be that based, I guess, but he would be very uncomfortable and would maybe start to understand his new position better.
Okay. Una, when they meet, what happens? How do they meet?
While I agree with most of the points made by the previous panelists, I think one of the things that we can definitely expect from the first meeting between Kurti and Vučić is that Kurti has built his legacy on insisting on radical transparency. And in the interviews he's done since their electoral victory in the parliamentary elections, he said that one of the things that he'll include into the dialogue that hasn't existed before is radical transparency. And this is something, at least when it comes to the first meetings, Milica rightly stressed the fact that he hasn't been tested in the arena of Kosovo-Serbia relations. It's easy for an opposition member to purport to purport that he will do things completely differently from everyone else. But he has insisted on radical transparency, and I think that might make Vučić uncomfortable, because at least this is the feeling among journalists who've covered the dialogue. Even though after respective meetings they would come out and often deliver sort of somewhat contradicting statements, they we journalists believe that they somehow had agreed on this is what you sell your public, or how you sell this agreement to your public, and this is how we're going to sell this agreement to our public. I feel that Kurti initially will not adhere to that, and that we can. I don't know exactly how that will affect the dialogue, but I think that we can initially expect that he will be very, very blunt in relaying what happened in these meetings behind closed doors. And whether or not this will, persist throughout the whole dialogue whenever it starts again, I agree with Agon's point that this is not going to happen very soon, but it might even change the approach of the EU to the dialogue, because if you have one of the parties in the dialogue talking about all of the, let's say, not underhand or under the table deals, but ones that they would probably have liked not to publicize right away, I feel that could change sort of the spirit of the dialogue in general. This is Kurti's legacy as an opposition member and as a political figure in general, and I, for one, as a journalist, look forward to understanding and knowing more about what actually happens at these meetings.
Stefan, how easy will it be for Vučić to go to that meeting? They've been talking about Kurti so far.
At this moment, your question sounds very idealistic, so give me the opportunity to have an idealistic answer. I believe that their meeting will open the new framework of the negotiation process, and that they will say that normalization, reconciliation, understanding, dealing with the past are our societal and national interests. Also, I hope that they will stop excusing themselves for talking to the other side, because that's what the EU or the US partners wants them to do. I think that we are in an absurd situation when Vučić meets Tači or Kurti in the future. That is act of patriotism. When I meet Agon, that is an act of betrayal. If Serbian list participates in the Kosovo election for the Kosovo's parliament, then that is act of patriotism and in accordance with Serbian national interests. Also, if a Serbian peasant from Staro Gradsko has Kosovo's identity card, he's a traitor of Serbian national interests. And that is the absurd. Also, it's so absurd that when Serbs in the north of Kosovo display Serbian flag, then that is considered as something like against Kosovo's sovereignty. But when the largest party in Kosovo wave the flags of neighboring Albania, then they are seen as the biggest protectors of Kosovo's sovereignty. So we need to leave that absurd, and I hope that Vučić and Kurti will also leave that absurd.
Well, thank you. Speaking about absurds, but also, Una, about changing EU stance on the dialogue, what is the EU stance on the dialogue? We've seen so many different things over the years. We've seen normalization. We've seen a rush for a quick fix with some borders being changed. We've seen nothing. We've been debating here at the forum a very critical point of giving just a date, not membership, nothing, a date to start talking to Macedonia and Albania, as if nobody has any memories. I don't know, you people probably have memories. I do have memories. I remember in 2005, the government led by same SDSM passes the most difficult reform on territorial reorganization of Macedonia. Prime Minister at the time, Bučkovski, was almost burned alive by his own people in Struga at the party meeting. He jumps out of the window. He loses two coalition partners. France blocks the date in 2005 in December, same thing as what they were voting on right now. Then in April we had Gruevski, for 10 years enjoyed the architecture and corruption. Then people make another attempt to do the right thing. Some of them get chairs thrown into them, some have her hair pulled out. They do go through that. They pass the right decision, and again, it's not the time. I don't get it. We are supposed, I thought, to support the moderates, not to support the radicals. So, Una, what's the EU policy on this? How do we support all of this?
I thought you could give me an answer to that. At least us journalists have had a hard time sort of pinning it down over the years.
With Serbia, that's the most important.
I think the worst thing is that I interviewed Kurti a couple of days ago, and he said that we're not taking over. Of course, they, meaning the previous governments, including Ramush Haradinaj and Hashim Thaçi, were not going to give up power when it was easy. They only chose to stand down or to sort of hand over power easily now because they know that the situation is at a breaking point. One thing that can definitely not continue anymore, and this is felt, I feel, with citizens both in Kosovo and in Serbia, is that you cannot sell the compromises, the difficult compromises of the dialogue, as strive for achieving some overarching universal EU values. You can't go out after a meeting and say, this is because we will be accepted into the EU as part of a family of equals. Nobody's going to buy this in Kosovo or Serbia anymore. What people like referring to as the carrot, the EU carrot, that at the end of the stick that made it easier for, like, let's say in Kosovo Republic, agreements such as the Montenegro border deal, even though it of course faced a lot of resistance, but to sort of pass in Parliament, the association agreement to pass in Parliament and stuff like that, was because there was a consensus amongst the public that it's okay, we're fighting for something greater. And this isn't only because of the internal sort of disharmony in the EU and Brexit and everything else that's going on. It's also because too few promises were fulfilled when it comes to Kosovo. We know that Serbia has already gone much more ahead in terms of the becoming in its accession talks, but Kosovo has gotten so little over the years in terms of actual progress on this path, or a final confirmation of a statehood. One of the carrots that was mentioned over all these years was the fact that if Kosovo participates in the dialogue, it'll be the EU will find a way to not force, but to make. It will lead to the 5 non-recognizing members in the EU to recognizing Kosovo, and that is completely impossible at this point. And so I think that the dialogue needs complete restructuring, that both sides need to be much more frank with their populations. Of course, this has been something that should have happened a long time ago, but you cannot. I mean, as a journalist who's followed these things over all these years and has then talked to people about the results of the dialogue, whatever they were, or weren't, I cannot go up to someone and say, should we do this because of EU accession? Or should we do this because the EU is so great and we want to be part of this? That's not going to fly anymore. So,
what do you think when you say they need to be more frank with their populations? What does it mean?
They need to be more frank with their populations. I think this kind of ties in to what Stefan said about patriotism and betrayal and the whole framing of the dialogue, but you cannot. The Kosovo Albanian population think that their problem is the most important problem in the world. The Serbian citizens of Serbia think that their problem is the most important problem in the world. And not only has the EU, and the EU kind of played along, it was like, oh, we have these high-level sort of commissioners that are going to be part of this. We all the pomp and circumstance that went with like the dialogue was about framing it as this like historical massive moment for both citizens of both countries, and that is not can't work anymore. I think that Kurti, if he were to listen to me, should sit down and say or when he talks to his population, say we are a tiny nation that is almost entirely insignificant if it weren't for this political problem that it currently faces. And the same thing should go for Vučić talking to his citizens, being, you believe that this is a big historical crossroads. We, Serbia, between the East and the West, and having all these supporters and people who are part of the dialogue, have stances on the dialogue, that's not it. You have part of the EU, a very important country in the EU, leaving the EU. You have it barely being able to deal with situations on its borders like Ukraine. And once citizens are actually talked to like adults, and said, we have to do this because everything else will make it much harder and much worse for us.
And just to dovetail, thank you so much, to this, what you just said, there's also a debate whether the talks should be secret, not secret, transparent, not transparent, and most of the diplomats are telling you, what is transparent? Nobody negotiates in a transparent manner. Have you heard of Facebook? I heard of Facebook. In this day and age, when you can read everything on Twitter, everything on Facebook, the information goes so fast, you cannot be fully not transparent. And you certainly cannot do what has been happening so far, tell one thing to the public, but do completely different thing behind the closed doors. Stefan, why haven't we succeeded so far?
I think that the previous dialogue failed because it was not defined what the main purpose of the dialogue was. Both sides interpreted normalization in a completely different way. Also, so-called constructive ambiguity led to the counter effect. Because you cannot normalize relations when one side talking about borders and the other about so-called administrative crossings, or one side about community and the other about association of Serbian municipalities. In the end, what is the legal effect of these agreements? Because the Constitutional Court of Serbia have ruled that the Brussels Agreement is a political document without legal consequences, whereas the Kosovo Constitutional Court see it as legally binding international agreement with some controversial points, and which is why it has never been implemented. But that is the crucial problem of the dialogue. How can we believe in a final agreement when, if not even the first one, has been implemented? And I especially think the community of Serbian municipalities, because Kosovo missed the chance to integrate Serbs with the community or association of Serbian municipalities and create a multi-ethnic society. Because once the Kosovo authorities have signed a binding agreement, how can they now say we've changed our minds? That was a bad idea. Just imagine the consequences that Serbia's position, we've changed our minds about integrating Serbs in the north of Kosovo into the institutions of Kosovo would cause. Simply, who can guarantee that any agreement will be enforced in the future upon signature when there are no international sanctions for non-compliance? And I think that we need in some new framework of the dialogue concrete international sanctions. So just to underline, I think that the dialogue failed because the goal was not clearly defined. Not all provisions of the agreement have been respected and legally enforced, and no international penalty has been established for failing to implement the agreement.
Is that how you see it too?
Well, I think maybe the goal was not clearly defined, but I think the intention was clear, and that's why what happened yesterday, or what's happening at EU level in relation to the Western Balkans, is fundamentally critical, is that the dialogue was placed at the EU turned into a peace-building instrument. It was the key anchor to make this work. The accession promise was the key anchor to make this work because it would give something to Serbia, because the expectation was that, at least in Serbia, that Serbia needs to get something for Kosovo's recognition, while at the same time keeping Kosovo, consolidating Kosovo's statehood and preserving its unitary state, which is guaranteed by Ahtisaari framework. So removing that removes the key incentive for Serbia to engage in this, and this is why. Why it's very important to focus on what happened yesterday in Brussels, and especially with the French position. And it has been. I don't know if France or anybody in Europe is really aware of the disaster it's sort of brewing in the region. I know you said that this should not be a shouting match between us, so I'll channel all of that energy into pessimism and depression towards our foreign actors.
But politely.
But polite, no. I don't know if it's polite to say that Emmanuel Macron, yesterday, although he's trying to position himself as this big European geopolitical player, for us in the Balkans he sounds like the European Trump. With that sort of dismissive, sort of not even second category. Okay, Poland and those Eastern European, Central Europe is kind of like the second tier, and the Balkans are now third tier. So it removes the incentive for Vučić to engage. It changes the calculus of how the entire region thinks. The lack of a credible EU accession perspective is. Sort of brings, to idea, especially now it involves Albania as well. The way Albania was treated yesterday as well, not just by the French but also by the Dutch, where there's xenophobic arguments, and Kosovo. I'm forgetting Kosovo, which still doesn't have visa liberalization, the only country in Europe not to have visa liberalization, is sending the kind of signals where the EU is sort of giving up its role in the region. And people will start to prioritize the security architecture in the region. And so it not only, in the current situation, if I am Vučić, why do I, we saw the poll numbers yesterday in terms of how popular any agreement with Kosovo is, why continue to engage with this? If I am Kosovo and Albania, and especially in Kosovo, what is Albin Kurti's in sort of incentive as well? There is no domestic demand for an agreement. People voted him primarily as a protest vote for domestic issues, anti-corruption, rule of law, economic growth. This is not in people's sort of priority. He does not have any.
So let me stop you here, because I think this is critical. Yeah. If we don't have external incentives, if they're disappearing, if the domestic incentives are not there, where are we?
That's why I'm saying we're moving from sort of stalemate to deterioration, and this is going to be a 5 to 10 year thing, I fear.
Is there anything that can be done?
A structural thing, and last year we were at the same panel, and I kind of said that if there was no agreement within the next year, the last year, which has already passed, we are going into this new dynamic. I really, this is my main worry, because the other driver, which is domestic demand, socially driven, process, is nowhere. We saw how big the ethnic distance is in the polling numbers yesterday. There's a huge mistrust. There's a huge disconnect between societies that has been fed by the political elites, because they wanted to kind of monopolize the ownership over the dialogue, and while at the same time playing this double game of keeping tensions high and presenting themselves as the only interlocutors that could strike a deal. But they have less. Now we're stuck in a situation where there's no foreign support for this, or there's like diverging sort of voices. The political calculus domestically, both in Kosovo and Serbia, is complicated for anybody to go and push this, or nobody has the political capital to do it. Whereas at the social level, the level of hate and the level of, I think the key message should be for people in the region. We have externalized for the past decade a lot of the responsibility I'm doing a little bit of that here today, but more out of sort of real fears. We've spent too much time relying on the EU, but we should realize that we're alone. And I think this should be the realization after yesterday. In the Balkans, we are alone. We should find ways at the social level to start to begin with, start finding some sort of domestic solutions to the regional problems, and stop relying on Berlin, on Paris, on Brussels, on DC, and start coming up with grassroots solutions, because we are coming into a very dangerous territory from a security perspective, where, now I hear this talk, well, maybe we can replace the EU accession membership with some sort of European promise to a European economic area. It does not have the same pull. It does not have the same symbolic power. It could be useful. It could be good, because the economic component is very important, but, it will, with all these authoritarian influences, really thriving in this environment, we are in really dangerous territory, and we need to come up with some sort of regionally based solutions, that prevent the situation from deteriorating into the kind of scenarios that I think we should really start talking about now.
Milica, are we really alone? We have this very active French-German effort to restart the dialogue. We have never had two envoys. We have two American envoys. We probably will have very soon an EU envoy, unless Borrell will decide to deal with this like Mogherini has. Are we really alone? Or what all this activity means for the process?
Well, as English speakers would say, too many cooks spoil a broth, and that's also my position here. I feel like we could see that at a panel yesterday. You have now external factors that are more vocal about what they want from the dialogue. Unfortunately, their requests towards the negotiating parties are often mutually exclusive. So it's going to be hard enough for Vučić and presumably Kurti to get the internal political consensus on what it is to be done with the dialogue and how this agreement should look like. But now they also have to face the requests from external factors. And for example, Kurti is going to be pulled to two sides. One is what seems to be Germany's position, who is very explicit on what they don't want to see from the agreement. So we don't want border change, but are vague as to how the parties should get there. So they're not really, they just know what they don't want. And then you have Americans who are very explicit about what they want. They want mutual recognition, but are more flexible to how the parties get to that. So it's, and then you have Vučić, who is going to have also Germans and the US, and in addition Russia, who is telling him, no, the resolution 1244 should be the framework. And then the Brits are also somewhere there trying to set up their own parameters. All of these actors don't have immediate interest into two nations relations, but they are still trying to make this box and say, okay, you can make an agreement, you should make an agreement, but within this box. Unfortunately, their boxes don't have a common area. That's the issue. So I really, I think that these types of pressures, these instructions as to how these people should be discussing this issue are very harmful, and I think that they will again lead to the disruption of the dialogue. What again we could hear on the panel yesterday is Ms. Ashton saying the parties made to the first agreement because we didn't tell them you should do this or you should do that. So that first incentive was obviously positive. It made the parties sit on the table and discuss, but at one point you have to back off and show some respect of those negotiators. It's like they're treating them as children. They are telling them, yes, you should agree, we all want you to agree. Especially the Americans would say there's a sense of urgency, there's a narrow window of opportunity, all those things I've heard Americans say. So they want to rush the agreement, but want to rush them under their own conditions. So they say you negotiators should decide what to do as soon as possible, but just don't decide this. That's not okay. You are showing that you don't trust these people. In Germany as well, they would say, don't make an agreement that's going to destabilize the region. Okay, that's a valid request, but if these negotiators that you have are showing you that they might get to an agreement that is going to destabilize the region, then why even push them to negotiate? They're obviously not fitting some sort of standards that EU has or expects from them. And I also have to say that there is a reason why we got into this situation, because in 2012, 2013, Vučić was on the verge, like he almost recognized Kosovo, but then Kosovo made what I think is the biggest mistake of Kosovo government, which is trying to avoid implementing the Serb majority association, and this gave the space to Vučić to first present Kosovo as an unreliable side in the dialogue, and then to ask for additional concessions. Agon opened my eyes some months ago, explaining to me how for Kosovo 2008 and the Ahtisaari and the constitution was already a concession to Kosovo Serbs. We never really considered that as a possibility, but he explained it to me, and I can understand his position. But because the association was not formed, Vučić had the right to stop the further integration, and he can now share the blame. Had Kosovo done their part, Vučić would be the only one to blame. Now he's not, so he has this space to ask for concessions. And unfortunately, now we're in this very interesting situation where Serbia was being told you're not realistic about the situation on the field, but now Kosovo seems to be not realistic about how things are, what's the power struggle between the negotiators.
All right. Well, we spent about half an hour talking what has been done wrong. Because there are so many people here, I'm sure some of you have questions. Let's spend about half an hour what should be done right. So, Una, where would you start now? You know, there are lots of schools of thoughts. I see that the new American envoy, Trump's envoy, the latest envoy, wants to do it fast. I hear there is a desire to reach an agreement by February. Some people are saying, forget about it. There are so many things that are not in place. Milica just told us without a basic agreement between the main European powers and the US, it's very difficult to get there. We still need the government in Kosovo to form. God knows how long that will take. So if we start building a better process, how will we go around it? What should we do?
I wouldn't go into the specifics of agreements and the dialogue. I would go into what should be done, stress that one thing that should be done right is that, not that the rhetoric of politicians can be controlled as such, but for there not to be a descent into insular sort of thinking or increased nationalist thinking. I'm afraid that, I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the North Macedonian government at this point, because their population is now only going to react to rhetoric or policies that are similar, or going to react more, not everyone of course, but to policies and rhetoric that is similar to what's going on in Poland or in Hungary or in other parts of the EU. Because when everything goes wrong, these politicians don't think long term. They think, how do I stay in power for this mandate and the next one? And then, and a lot of it, oftentimes, that includes rhetoric that's nationalist. The same thing goes for Albania. Albania is even worse off. I'm not that Edi Rama was a nationalist to start with, but I see a situation where it could be, where these politicians could realize that their power is, since they can't control the process, their power is in causing chaos. I can cause problems for you if you don't, since I can't be a productive part of the dialogue. So Edi Rama could become more involved in at least rhetorically, in the whole Kosovo issue, in the Macedonia issue or the Macedonian-Albanian issue. Macedonian Albanians and Montenegro, I wouldn't go as far. I think Đukanović has for some reason been able to manage that. But the same thing goes for Serbia. You create strange bedfellows with inefficiency. Dodik said a couple of days ago, he said, I'm so glad that Kurti got elected, because now we will have the Albanians to just join Albania, we should do the redrawing of territories, have the South join Albania, and us, Republika Srpska, join Serbia. And this is what is created with situations that are inefficient. So I think that one thing that should be done right, sort of briefly conclude, is really, whether it's civil society, journalists, anyone who can sort of have the public's ear in any way, try to minimize this rhetoric that's going to only become worse and worse. Because, I mean, this has happened when countries like Poland that were very successful economically, they went into the EU with this massive euphoria of most of the sort of former socialist countries. It was very positively inclined towards the EU. And now you have a government that sees the EU as an enemy, at least when it comes to public rhetoric. So, I mean, if it happened in places like Poland, why wouldn't it happen in Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, North Macedonia, or Albania?
Stefan, the new high rep is going to start traveling. No, wait a second. The new high rep will start traveling to Pristina. He says his first trip will be in Pristina. So your advice to him, continuing the theme, how should they structure the new people in the European Commission and the EAS? What should they do? How should they structure the process?
First, I would like to highlight that we need to rescue the Belgrade-Pristina relations and the Kosovo issue from the EU framework and the framework of EU membership perspective. Because let's imagine that we do not want to become a part of the EU, and imagine that EU doesn't have interest to admit us. We again have a need and obligation to reconcile and normalize our relations. And I think that is the main goal. That is national and societal goal of both societies, Kosovo and Serbian, to communicate, to have good examples of cooperation. With or without EU, maybe my story is too idealistic, but despite the fact that we do not have open door for the full EU membership, we have really concrete problems between our two societies. Also, I think that the dialogue requires a new framework. And I believe that evaluating previous deals would be a good starting point. Also, the dialogue should have a clearly defined objective without constructive ambiguity, with the active involvement of the EU as a mediator and facilitator, that's it, and supported by the US government. Also, one of the major drawbacks of the previous dialogue has been the absence of deadlines. And any future agreement must specify the topic, time for the implementation, verification, and confirmation of the commitment. As well, as I mentioned before, sanctions for non-compliance. And again, international financial support to implement what has been agreed. Also, I think that the crucial role how politicians, they need to support public relations and communication between two societies through especially public appearances. And the media need to encourage and showcase examples of good cooperation. And that is a new framework for the new dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina.
If you, citing you, rescue, you said, the dialogue from the EU perspective or EU framework, then what are the carrots and sticks of the mediators in the process?
Normal life. Normal life of Serbs and Albanians. I think that's the main goal. And we are in a permanent limbo. We are living a limbo, and we are in permanent post-conflict management. And if we wanted to finish a state-building process of Serbia and Kosovo, we need to achieve concrete, legally binding, comprehensive agreement. And that is the carrot, normal life of people.
What is the incentive for the leaders to do that?
For the leaders to change completely the framework and the atmosphere. That shaking hands and communication with the other side is not the act of betrayal.
Agon, how do you see all of this, the possible new process?
I mean, Borrell can come in Pristina, but I don't see anything could happen from that. You know, the EU has no leverage. Borrell has no leverage, and the EU is sort of lost all of its weight in this process. If there is anything that could happen in the next year, that might come more from this U.S. initiative. But even there, it's a bit difficult to read, what actually the incentives would be. We're not joining the U.S.
Well, we heard
some Kosovars would want to, but
we heard it. That's important. Let me just pause here. I think because it's important. We heard in the media that the incentives will be economic. We hear that big American transnational companies will come, sprinkle billions of dollars here. So would that work or not?
We'll have to see first. It's very unclear, and especially like the speed with which they want to do this is a bit, makes me a bit skeptical. And while I agree with Stefan that we do obviously have a clear interest to resolving this, just without any of these external kind of dynamics. We have to resolve it for our own sake. With this political elite, I don't see it happening. So I think that currently, the kind of leaderships that are in place will lead to further, deterioration and distancing, because there is no, they will think about power, they will think about what voters want, and voters do not want an agreement. Or at least on neither side, there is popular support for anything, any kind of compromise. On Kosovo side, Milica mentioned, for Kosovars, we believe that we gave our compromise in 2008, and we left it to the international supporters of our Declaration of Independence to resolve the remaining part with Serbia. And now it's going to be incredibly difficult, especially for someone like Kurti, to move and to make any substantial other compromise. I'd like to touch upon something that Una mentioned. The EU has been pushing this ball with Macedonia and Albania for a while, and it's been what people are reading, what's happening with Macedonia. That's kind of like a proxy indicator for others in the region. Like they're trying to figure out, is this Franco-German disagreement about accession going to be resolved or not? And I think over the next few months, what will be critical is to get some sort of signal from European capitals. How do they view the future of this region? Do we start a new kind of? This is now beyond Kosovo and Serbia. We're moving into a point where this is beyond Kosovo and Serbia. And if there is no clarity, if there is no other credible process in place, then that's why I said the security architecture will take priority. Political elites will, revert a little bit to nationalism. I agree with Una's assessment. Kosovo and Albania will continue. I think there will be continuous movement towards some sort of, in the next couple of years, some sort of confederation kind of approach between the two countries. I mean, Albin Kurti is, for the past 2 decades or more, he's the main proponent of unification with Albania. With Albania not seeing any EU accession perspective, it too could sort of move in that direction. So imagine that scenario, and then how that reflects into Serbia and into Bosnia. So I think this is the kind of moment we are entering now, and that's why I said I don't know if Macron is aware while he's doing these big geopolitical plays, what is he causing right here in the middle of Europe. I mean, I'd like to say middle of Europe, not even backyard. This is Europe. I think we're entering that phase, and that's why with so many variables in play, it's so difficult to predict what will happen. But what I think that, since your question is what we should do, is that we should not neglect what was neglected over the past decade, is just leave this entire process to political elites, but we should start some bit of a more of a social process of dialogue that, between civil society, we try to do this within Kosovo as part of some informal groups that we have to build some sort of consensus, so that when the security situation starts to deteriorate, we can at least keep things normal and build some sort of resilience to any kind of negative development. I'm not foreseeing positive developments. What I'm hoping, at least, is that we prevent some sort of more serious escalation.
But that will take time. What's in the meantime?
In the meantime,
I know it's very important because if I understand all of you, actually, that with the absence of tangible EU perspective immediately now, we have to work on the domestic pressure on the societies. We have to work in the societies, pressure on the leaders from below. I understand that's as important, hasn't been done, but that will take time. What's in the meantime?
In the meantime, I think if there is one form of pressure that could be, or at least exerted by foreign actors, is to keep at least the level of discourse from the political elites, so that they don't instigate something. I think we're entering the kind of phase where one small incident, and then heated media rhetoric could. I think we're entering a phase of containment rather than solutions. So, if at least some of the foreign sort of interlocutors could at least try to make sure that the rhetoric doesn't get heated, that incidents are not instigated, and this is the time for foreign actors, for authoritarian, for Russia, for all these actors to kind of, if they want to destabilize the region. This is now the next couple of years will be a perfect time. They've tried to do it over the past few years, and I think as a region we should be proud that Balkans showed quite considerable resilience in Montenegro, in Macedonia, in not falling for some of these traps. But I fear that resilience might not hold over the next couple of years. So, as I said, we're not gonna be a shouting match between us here. It's gonna be a, sort of me venting all of that to especially European countries for failing miserably to show some leadership. And can you imagine? I mean, just to conclude with this, everybody was. Some European diplomats like Carl Bildt were complaining how Ukrainian President Zelensky was complaining to Trump about the unreliability of European leaders. And well, his words sounded very, even in the age of Trump, the U.S. is sometimes more reliable than Europe, and that just shows how skeptical and pessimistic, and how Europe has failed to sort of become a geopolitical player that Macron or Borrell are trying to make it.
Well, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience to this conversation today. But before we do that, I still have in my plans at least 7 minutes to ask maybe perhaps the most difficult question. But since none of you is a politician, you all belong to either an academic or civil, well, academia is also a civil society, to civil society. So if I ask you this question, you won't be thrown out of the political party if you will give a wrong answer. My question is, in terms of solutions, have you thought for the whole problem? We saw yesterday our friends told us, no recognition, UN membership, recognition, full, and so on and so forth. Has there been some out-of-the-box solution that nobody has thought of, but you have? Even the beginnings of the solution. Yesterday we were looking at, when our friends presented their brilliant research, 2 models. For those of you who were not there, was one model full legal recognition, and the other one was no recognition by Serbia, but with the UN seat for Kosovo. Since you are the thinking people and not political people, and nobody will throw you out of a political party for saying these things, has anything that has not been mentioned? Is there something out of box thing? Milica, yeah, no? Anyone?
No, there isn't any out-of-the-box solution, and I think that's because Kosovo is bent on getting the recognition, and then Serbia is bent on putting the highest price on that request. And it seems to be that it's not possible to reach anything outside of that will be conclusive enough. That stems from, maybe even Agon is better to explain this, but this stems from the distrust of majority population in Kosovo towards Serbia, and from what I understand, the majority population is afraid if they don't receive recognition from Serbia, that Serbia might one day sort of come back to Kosovo. So this is really the stomping point. The request for recognition is really the stomping point for any solution outside of the box, because the distrust is so vast. And as you well mentioned, the research yesterday, and this is one of the main things that I think maybe the EU should be focusing on primarily media in Serbia and how they are literally dehumanizing Albanians every single day. This is very troubling, and we are starting to have also hints that this might start happening in Kosovo, not through media, but you have Kurti, who is saying, I want a dialogue with Kosovo Serbs. He's been saying this for years, and then he says at the same time, I will only speak to Serbs that recognize Kosovo. You will not find many Kosovo Serbs that will accept to come to a meeting with you, after which meeting you will come out and say, these are the Serbs that recognize Kosovo. This will endanger them, even if they do feel that way, but I don't think that there's even 1% of Serbs that feel that way. So if he cannot think to sit down and speak to a Serb that will tell him, I don't recognize Kosovo, and if you have people on the Serbian side that go all red or berserk if somebody refers to Kosovo as a country, then you don't really have a good situation to start anything up. So if I were EU, I would focus on this hate speech that is coming from the media every day, and that is reflecting then on the relations in Kosovo. When Informer publishes that Shaward would kill Serbs or cut off their heads, of course Albanians in Kosovo will get offended by that, because of course there's no single nation that is that every single individual from that nation is the same. So they will resent Kosovo Serbs for that, and that does increase the possibility of Kosovo Serbs getting into difficult positions in Kosovo because the Serbian media are doing this. So unless something is done about that, so now there isn't any really interest in normalizing relations, not from politicians nor from the society, but not even society is going to be able to give that push unless we realize that we're pretty much very alike individuals, especially when it comes to our national identity and how we cling to segments of that national identity, and to which extent actually we're very similar into how we act and how emotions drive our political decisions, both Albanians and Serbs.
Una?
I think that, so all of us can agree that the sort of normal developmental processes that countries in post-conflict situations go through were, especially with regard to Serbia and Kosovo, but to some extent Bosnia as well, were put on hold while the dialogue was taking place, or until this issue would be resolved. In both Kosovo and Serbia, it's very easy for politicians, because this is the setting that has been created, for politicians on both sides to ignore economic questions, developmental questions, everything else, because the dialogue is of national, as Stefan said, of national sort of significance and historic significance. I feel that one thing, talking to people in the whole region, not just Kosovo and Serbia, one way to do this was, why not put it on its head until have something on the back burner that is related to the dialogue and getting it somewhere and sort of normalizing these views. But I think something along the lines of a mini Marshall Plan for the Western Balkans that would have strategic investments and boost local economies could sort of remove the existential threat that these people deal with. Because when you remove the fear, because nationalism is paired with an existential threat. I feel that my existence is threatened, which includes my financial existence, my existence in society, my basic human rights, are threatened by another population group. Even in the case of Yugoslavia, this helped a lot in creating better relations between Kosovo as the autonomous province and Serbia when there were key economic investments in areas that made the standard of living better. And so until we get to political agreement, have before that I would, with all the money that's spent on various initiatives in the Balkan, I know that the Western Balkan 6 was also part of this, but maybe sort of reinvigorate the Western Balkan 6, include strategic investments and increase sort of economic productivity, inject that into the economies of the region, because then I feel people will sort of, that's the best way at keeping these populations that are very, very skeptical right now from becoming radicalized or escalating tensions.
All right, well, we have half an hour left, and I would like to get some questions from the audience so you feel you didn't come here for nothing. Please identify yourself. Do not make speeches. Ask a question. Tell us what the panelists should explore further. If you want to make a speech, write a blog, organize your own panel, but identify yourself and keep it to 1 minute. I have one hand here so far, and then another over there. We'll take 3 questions, and then we'll go take another round. Please.
Nemanja Jovanovic from Gračanica. Just a question for all the panel members, and I don't want to steal your job, Alex. You always knew how to intrigue the panels, the members of the panel, but I want to throw in another question. What they think about another combination, LDK, PDK, and all others that may lead toward the agreement?
Okay. I saw one hand right here in the middle. We need a mic there. Please stand up so they can see you easier.
Hi, I'm Michael Colburn. I'm a journalist. My question for the panel is, I am a journalist who has worked in both Ukraine and here in the Western Balkans, and I've been struck by the number, how similar some of the challenges that political leaders face in both environments. That being said, I find that, especially as somebody who's done more work in Ukraine than here, to be honest, that there is it's almost like the two environments, the two worlds are completely walled off. But I think there is an opportunity to learn from each other in both environments. So I'm wondering, from those from the panel who are familiar with Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and just Ukraine in general, is there anything from the ongoing Ukrainian experience that could apply to the dialogue process today?
And I saw one hand over here. Please stand up so they can see you, people with the mics. And then we'll take another round after we address this one, please.
Thank you. My name is Adam. I'm a student from Faculty of Security Studies here in Belgrade. And I have a question for any of the panelists who would like to answer it. And the question relates to possible unification of Kosovo Albania that was mentioned. There is support of it in Kosovo. And if it was to happen, what kind of effect would it have on Serbia and possibly Bosnia and the region? Thank you.
Thank you. Agon, so a different combination, not Kurti, Vetvendosi, LDK, but a combination of LDK, PDK, and everyone else, so without Kurti.
I mean,
what does that mean?
Theoretically, it's possible, but politically, it's rather explosive, I would say, because for anybody to try to engineer something like that, there have to be some goddamn certainty that there will be a deal, and some goddamn certainty that that deal will be good for Kosovo. Because then having Albin Kurti thrown into opposition after what is perceived as a win, together with Ramush Haradinaj also in opposition, would be a very destabilizing scenario. And I would suggest that whoever is thinking in those terms, Albin Kurti has won a mandate in clear rules that were set between LDK and Vetvendosi that whoever comes in first gets to become prime minister. So the rules of the game were clear before, and any attempts to sort of subvert that will be very destabilizing.
Why?
Because I think they will ignite. If the idea is to then reach an agreement, they would create a very powerful. And I really think Albin Kurti will come back from this even stronger. And secondly, because Vetvendosi has a lot of power now, and because of the way Kosovo system works, they could prolong the creation of the parliament. They have ways to postponing this or sort of blocking anything for the next.
Just like PDK did last time.
Last
4
time,
months,
so
yeah.
4 or 5 months, they have a lot of blocking power. So it's not that they can just do that right away. But fundamentally, I think it will be a very undemocratic and very but also politically a wrong move, especially in light that it's not like the other variables are aligned and that the deal is there. So I would think that would be just a huge political adventure. Do I answer some of the other questions, or?
Well, I think Una is the best position to answer the second question, okay. And then we'll come back to the others. Ukraine, lessons learned? Are there any lessons here? And there are lessons from here to there. I mean, this goes both ways.
I would take all these Balkan leaders, but especially leaders of Kosovo and Serbia, to go on a field trip to Ukraine and to actually see, to Donbass in Crimea, and to actually see what it really means to have problems and not be able to control your territory and not be able, and be in the position where the EU has its hands tied, where the US has its hands tied, and actually can't do that much to change, to improve the situation for the country. Kosovo, if anyone who compares these two should think, I keep thinking that like both the Kosovo and Serb leaders are very spoiled, because what the current president, with all his faults, has to juggle a situation where he has an ongoing war in the east, a territory that's for more or less foregone, or it will not be part of Ukraine, and somehow still has to moderate his rhetoric. If you put Vučić in charge of Ukraine, it would have been, or Kurti maybe, Thaci, Vučić especially, in charge of Ukraine, with his rhetoric and mindset, it would be catastrophic. So, but what the similarities between the two are, they're both are some of the main foreign policy challenges for the EU. This is in Ukraine and in the Western Balkans. The EU acts as a foreign policy actor or as a mediator in this regard. I think that a lot can be learned from the fact that Zelensky manages to still go to the front and show his sort of support for the Ukrainian soldiers, but also not use, let's say, the rhetoric of his predecessor, Poroshenko, and use nationalist, sort of very confrontational rhetoric with Russia. He manages to and this is someone who isn't a politician, who's a comedian and an actor, and if he can manage to do it, I feel like these people who've been like in parliaments for ages and ages and ages to do a bit better. But he manages to criticize Putin, but also not inflame tensions as much as, let's say, again, Poroshenko did before him. This is a big one. The other thing is, especially Kosovars, I think Kosovo politicians should go and spend time in Ukraine, because Kosovo effectively, not fully, but effectively has control and presence in the north. It can make people's lives better. It can actually change things. Zelensky doesn't control the areas, the Donbass areas in Donbass, and especially not Crimea. And if they were aware of what actually, because I feel like Kosovo could go towards a Ukraine situation if it doesn't stop doing what it's doing now.
Are there good lessons from here for Ukraine? For example, if you think of Georgia and the separatist territories, there people cannot travel, nobody recognizes anybody's documents. Here, everybody travels. Yes, you have to take your license plates on one side, unscrew and put whatever. But the lessons, actually, the Brussels Agreement, we forgot how much the Brussels Agreement has done for all of this. And this is why it was great to see Catherine Ashton here. The Brussels Agreement has done quite a bit. Is there a lesson from here to there?
From Kosovo to Ukraine?
From Kosovo, Serbia to Ukraine, to Georgia, going further east.
Strike the iron while it's hot. I think Ukraine should, at the moment we're starting the Normandy talks soon with the Steinmeier formula. A lot of it is actually very, very similar. You have this sort of split control over the territories and the way in which they participate in elections, very similar to things that were put into the Kosovo constitution and part of the Brussels dialogue. And if I were in Zelensky's place, because this is what Kosovo and Serbian leaders thought, like, this is the starting point for our agreement. We don't like it, so we'll fiddle with it until we get exactly what we want. And then things got worse, as they have gotten worse now. So if anyone in Ukraine were to learn from the Kosovo-Serbia situation, strike the iron while it's hot, get onto these. The first thing should be getting rid of the big issues. And whether if in 10 years there's a different solution for Donbass and Crimea, fantastic. But now, take what's on the table, because this wasn't a lesson. This wasn't made clear by the leaders in Serbia, or wasn't clear to the leaders in Serbia and Kosovo.
Let me take Nemanja's question and go back to you, Milica. Does it matter to the Kosovo Serbs who forms the coalition? Kurti and LDK, or PDK, LDK, and the others? Does it matter or not?
Sorry, Kosovo Serbs or?
For Kosovo Serbs and for Serbia as well. But first of all, for Kosovo Serbs, does it matter or not?
For Kosovo Serbs, it's pretty much the same. I mean, I don't think that Kurti can be much worse than Ramush.
Can he be better?
Let's hope. As I said, he's not my cup of tea. I don't expect many things from him. I think that he is not realistic about the Kosovo Serb community, but let's leave the room that I might be wrong. For Serbia and for Srpska list, it would be much better. LDK, PDK government would mean that they would be directly in the government, in the coalition government, and that they would have some sway in the assembly as to the
Because
support.
it will depend on their votes, right?
Yes,
Okay.
because precisely, and for them it would be better. But although I don't see that it brings much of a stronger position for Serbia, it's still going to be the same whether or not they can influence some of the decisions, because when Srpska list is blocking something, it's usually through double majority vote, and that is still going to be there regardless regardless if they are part of a coalition government or not. But I do agree with Agon. I don't see that happening because there's too much enthusiasm with Kosovo voters now over Betemen dossier taking over, and I really think that there might be even civil unrests if somebody tries to fiddle with the results, and it would be also a catastrophic move for LDK. So they would really have to be very unrational to do that. So I don't see that really
Can you
happening.
explain something to me, because I don't get it? It seems to me in Belgrade, they are more willing and more interested in talking to the former commanders of KLA, PDK, AAK, and the others, people about whom, there are reports, there are certain things. Some of them had to go to The Hague already, but there's absolutely no desire whatsoever to talk to Kurti, about whom Dick Marty wrote absolutely nothing. Why there is such an interest to talk to those people, but such an allergy to talk to someone who hasn't done certain things, or presumably hasn't done?
Yeah, there's two main things. First of all, you know what to expect from Ramush and Taci and these guys. They've been there for 20 years, and you know who they are and in which way to talk to them, so you know what to expect. With Kurti, you don't really know what to expect, what's going to be on the other side. There's that, but there's also the fact that precisely because of all of these things and the special court pressure that is coming now, that is coming on, Haradinaj and Taci and Kadri are all more... they have baggages from the past. They can be easily, what's the word? Ucenjeni?
Coerced.
Blackmailed. Yes, that's the word. Whereas you don't have much on Kurti except for his radical behaviors in the assembly. So at the same time, he's something new that you don't know what to expect from, except for radical moves, and they cannot be blackmailed. And you have these guys with which you already have a way of communicating. You know how to deal with them,
But
how
you
to
haven't
make
gotten
business.
nowhere with them. Don't they see an opportunity here, or this is such an allergy that...
Yeah, and I think it goes both ways, this sort of allergy. I think that the issue with Kurti is that he shows too much how resentful he is over the fact that he was a political prisoner and that something unjust was done to him. So he's too open about that. Like you cannot go to regional TV shows and say Serbia is to blame because Serbia cannot face its past. This is why the whole region is not in the EU. That makes you look petty and makes you look unreliable. I think that they are starting to be afraid that he will try to create a regional anti-Serb alliance, and they're just uncomfortable with this.
Any of you want to tackle the issue of unification Albania, Kosovo? Stefan?
I will cut the long story. Cut the long story short. First, I see at this point only the idea of demarcation or a border changing can include the unification of Albania and Kosovo, because then we have two countries that by mutual agreement recognize and approach the delineation and the demarcation of borders. Also, I think that the argument that there is no change of borders policy cuts no eyes, because the independent of whole Kosovo or the part of Kosovo or the unification of Kosovo, Albania have the same effect in international law and international order. But I'm against it. I'm against any idea of partition, because I do believe that Serbian community should be a relevant political and societal element in Kosovo. And that is impossible without the North, without an urban, economic, medical, political and educational center. Everything else, so-called Serbian municipalities, are a collection of villages that clustered around monasteries, and people will live that deserted areas.
Okay, Agon, a few words.
I think Kosovo is increasingly consolidating itself as a state. People within Kosovo are increasingly feeling that that Kosovo is their state. There's a state identity slowly developing, and whatever relations it might want to enter with Albania, it will enter them as a state. What I'm saying is that these large sort of structural dynamics, external dynamics, especially the security threat, with Serbia increasingly militarizing, with Russia constantly poking at Kosovo's statehood, with this sense of insecurity at bay. Kosovo and Albania might try to, at least at the security dimension, with a lack of any security guarantee, and there's a parallel with Ukraine right there. From Europe especially, Kosovo and Albania might try to intensify the relation, but only as, with Kosovo as being a state, because these are two different political realities, although with a strong sense of unity, like the feeling is there, that this is one nation, but these are two states.
Two more questions. We have 5 minutes. Anyone? All right. Anything to say before that you didn't say that you wanted to say? I think we covered everything. Agon. Oh, there is one question over there, but let him ask the question. You can.
Okay.
Tomasz Zornaczuk from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I was waiting with this question to the last round because it doesn't really go straight to the Kosovo issue that we discussed. But you, Una, mentioned that you wouldn't like to be in the shoes of Macedonian government, and you connected that with Poland and Hungary, and then translated it somehow on the whole region. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. So Poland is, I think, is such a great example for what could happen with the Western Balkans, because unlike all other Central and Eastern European countries, the ones that did end up in the EU, it had the euphoric feeling or sense for the EU that we see in the Balkans. Because even, I don't see it in the Czech Republic that much, or in Slovakia, even in Slovenia to some extent, but I do see it in the Western Balkans, where the EU is so highly regarded that it's seen as it truly lives up to the values that or in the minds of these people, that it's seen as to truly represent the values that I think the EU hopes to espouse. And then what happened? And this wasn't even a Poland that was very problematic. It didn't have any outstanding territorial issues. Economically, it was doing well. Yet this country, or the citizens of this country, were still treated and felt like second-class citizens in the EU. And this kept steamrolling, and then you had one government that was center-right that kind of thought that it should do this to increase the rights of the citizens, and then do that. And you have then the Law and Justice Party coming into power, mainly on their main slogan, even in these elections that happened 2 weeks ago, a week ago, they said, "We will return the dignity of the Polish people," and that resonates with the Western Balkans as well. We will return the dignity of the Serbs, the Albanians, the Macedonians, the Albanians in Albania, the Bosniaks, so many ethnicities, who can name all of them. We will return the dignity to these people, and this is something that the EU is not aware of. That when you in your insistence for like prolonged or thorough processes, which is, I guess, what Macron was trying to say when France vetoed the Macedonia and Albania decision, could instigate a situation where the population are like, you know what, we haven't been this is the Poland logic, but that applies to the Balkans as well. We have, throughout history, we have not been able to rely on anyone. We are the biggest victims, and as such, we will turn insular, like look inwards and focus on what Poland wants first, and then what everyone else wants second. And that, I feel, could be a very likely scenario. Not with this government, but we don't know how SDSM will handle this, but maybe the next government in Macedonia, or the next government, or the current government in Albania as well. And I feel that the same thing goes for Kosovo and Serbia.
Agon.
To conclude, right? Okay.
This clock is wrong.
I thought we had 10 minutes. Okay, no, just I think one brief point that I think is really important, since you started off by saying that this is the crowd that also likes to listen to one another and discuss, and to kind of humanize the discussion that sometimes went a lot at the policy level. I feel that what has been really important, and if you want to have that social drive to the dialogue more emphasized, is we've gone a little bit in the dialogue backwards. We thought that if you leave it to the elites, they'll have the political deal, and then we'll have, after that, more space for that social discussion about the past as well. I feel that by neglecting the past a lot, and this is where I maybe disagree with Milica when she said that, Kurti might sound petty when he talks about the past, is that, there is still that sense and that need, especially in Kosovo, for people to talk about what has happened, because without talking about what has happened, there can be no gates open to build that trust. So without talking about the war crimes, without talking about, and we know this from our own experience in Kosovo, and we discuss, we have these meetings sometimes where we call them sometimes even therapeutic meetings, where even it's okay to disagree and even express deep anger, because that is transformative, and that is, that opens the gate for a more constructive dialogue. So I really think that we can never have that drive or that social process without a process of, dealing with with war crimes, and without openly and frankly talking about them. And I don't see that happening, especially in Serbia, so this idea that this is an annoyance to talk about this is part of the problem.
I just need to clarify. So his statement went, because Serbia didn't reconcile with its own past, the whole region is not integrated into the EU. I think it's better to blame Serbia for Macedonia not getting into the EU, and I absolutely agree. There should be space for discussion. I just don't want to go off this panel with somebody thinking that I don't think that the past should be discussed. So the part of blaming Serbia for Bosnia or Macedonia or Albania or Montenegro being in the negotiation status which they are in now, that makes him petty, because that has really nothing to do with Serbia.
Well, we have to conclude at some point, and this is the point when we need to conclude. I'm surprised there were no more questions, probably with all these very deep analysis, an analysis that actually makes us think. You made all of these people think. So thank you for doing this.
Or you scared them with your don't make speeches.
We're going to disappear from the stage. You don't disappear. Please stay there. We are asking the organizers to actually come to the stage. 5 of us. 5 of us will disappear. Thank you for your attention. And now